thank you for joining us today for this, the first of our online gathering events for the Castle McGrath Society 2020 Clan Gathering. A little bit about the Castle McGrath Society. It was established in 2012 and we have membership from right across the world. We operate through our website www.clanmcgrath.org and through our Facebook page and Twitter page, both of which you can find on the front page of our website. My name's Sean Alexander McGrath, and I'm proud to be the Cian Finna, or the chieftain of the Castle McGrath Society. And I have the pleasure today to introduce you to the first of our presentations, which is the medieval castles of Ireland. And we're going to look at a closer study of the Castle McGrath, situated on the banks of Lough Erne, on the County Donegal, County Fermanagh border in the province of Ulster. The image you can see on your screen now is from a painting by Olive Duffy of County Armagh, and it's in my personal collection. It's a stylised and form of the castle set against Lough Erne in the background and Bow Island. We're going to move through this presentation. We'll look at the first defensive structures in Ireland and how those rose up. And then from the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, the introduction of stone buildings. And then we'll move on towards the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries and the development of a very specific style of Irish castle building known as the Tower House. We'll look at some images of those buildings and how they actually developed, and then look at the transition towards firearms and gunpowder and how that affected castle building, particularly with the development of the Castle McGrath, Termon McGrath in County Donegal. So the topic of today's presentation is the castles of medieval Ireland. So I suppose what we really need to do is to go back really right to the beginning of the medieval period, right back to the early medieval period of the 6th century. So Ireland is covered in very early medieval earthworks, or what are commonly known as ring forts. So these generally exist at the top of sort of high ground and hills, with quite a good view over the landscape. Their obvious position commands a defensive position, and from that there we can say that and dendrochronology dating of these sites has placed them really between the 6th and the 10th centuries. In Irish, they're called various names: Rath, anglicised R-A-T-H, Liss, Cashel, and Dun, or in English Dun or Dun. Really, they all describe the same thing: a defensive structure, primarily on a hilltop. In Ireland, there are up to 40,000. That's 40,000. It's a very large number that have been identified across the island of Ireland. That's probably 1 every 2 kilometres squared. So really a huge number. And if you think of what the population might have been, really between the 6th and the 10th centuries, quite a small population, spread quite far out, living in these really what were defensive homesteads, and also, of course, animal enclosures. The countryside was a dangerous place. The animals that existed, in terms of wolves and others, of course, were a threat to animals, so they again were enclosed primarily in these stockades or enclosures, again generally on high ground. So the ring forts themselves appear to have been abandoned in the 9th century, and there are various theories behind this. One of the most recent ones is quite an interesting one, which was actually the potential introduction of anthrax into Ireland through the Viking incursions and settlements of new towns around the Irish coast. The Vikings, known in Ireland mostly under the name of Danes, established Dublin, Wexford, Waterford and Limerick, and their names still exist in Irish place names, like for instance Strongbow in Ulster, the Strong Fjord. Anthrax, of course, when it may have been introduced, may have found its way into the population, and discoveries in Scottish Island, which experimented with anthrax as a biological weapon in the First World War. An island in Scotland shows that anthrax exists actually in the subsoil for a considerable period of time. If this is the case, and the theory is that potentially the anthrax existed in the soil for a considerable period of time after it made its way into the ring forts. Once abandoned, the ring forts then became places where people should not go. This is a really interesting theory, because we know that after the ring forts were abandoned, that they moved into Irish folklore as places to be avoided, because they became the dwelling place of the Sidhe or the fairy folk. And in the Irish countryside, of course, the ring fort is quite commonly known as a fairy fort. This is a really interesting theory. Whatever the case may be, whether it was anthrax or for some other reason, the hill forts themselves, the ring forts, did become associated with the folklore of Ireland, dwelling places, we said, of the Sidhe and the fairy folk, but also then became potential places of inauguration for chieftains. And we see that in Ulster particularly, with Tullyoak Fort. Tullyoak Fort lies between Dungannon and Cookstown in County Tyrone. It's an inauguration site of the O'Neill chieftains of Tyrone. And the O'Hagans were the clan that managed the inauguration site and the inauguration of those chieftains. Tullyoak Fort still exists today, and when you go there, it's quite clearly a hill fort in the sort of traditional sense of the word. It has high banks and ditches, and it's placed on a very prominent site, really right in the centre of Ulster. As part of the McGrath clan gathering in 2020, we were due to visit Tullyoak and the museum of the O'Neills and the Hill of O'Neill in Dungannon. So unfortunately, of course, because of the COVID-19 crisis, we were unable to make that journey. What we do know about the 9th century is that after this abandonment, we know that going forward another 300 years, Gerald of Wales, who came to Ireland as part of the Anglo-Norman invasion and shortly afterwards, tells us in his writings that by the 12th century the Irish had called the hill forts Dane forts, and that they had been largely abandoned by this time. So again, we still see the names of these raths, Duns, Lisses, in the place names of Ireland. So within the townlands of Ireland, you'll come across names like Rathmore, meaning the big or large ring fort, Dundrum in County Down, the fort on the ridge, and actually there was a pre-existing fort before the Normans built a stone castle on the same site. So you'll see these names throughout Ireland when you come here and you travel, that they indicate that there was once a ring fort in that particular location. It should be noted that the materials that were actually used in the development of these ring forts mostly would have been a palisade, so mounds of earth in a ring enclosure with a wooden palisade on top. Within that palisaded area, a number of probably wooden construction and thatched dwellings, and also potentially dwellings for animals within it. The palisaded enclosure would have been then gated in wood. However, in Ireland we also see stone enclosures. So these were built again on a hill in a ring enclosure, which would have given probably even more defence, certainly high walls of stone, and again topped with possibly a wooden palisade. So a fairly sturdy and strong defensive position for those dwelling within them. We talked about the Viking or Norse Dane settlements on Ireland's coasts, including Dublin, Wexford and Limerick, and how this introduction of town settlements changed the Irish landscape somewhat. Of course, we know that the settlement of the Danes in Ireland was not always a peaceful one, and in 1014 High King of Ireland Bran Boru fought a bloody campaign and eventually the Battle of Clontarf against a Hiberno Norse alliance of Sigrid Silkbeard, King of Dublin, and Sigurd of Orkney. Although High King Bran Boru was killed in the battle broke the power of the Vikings and the Kingdom of Dublin. The Vikings brought with them the concept of town living. To protect these settlements required defences, and so we see the emergence of town walls. Dublin's Viking walls were uncovered during excavations in the late 1970s and 1980s and show robust stone-built walls up to 4 metres high. However, it wasn't until the arrival of the Vikings' cousins, the Anglo-Normans, that wall building in stone for defensive purposes really took hold in Ireland. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, invaded Saxon England and took the kingdom. Normandy was named after the Norsemen who had settled in this part of France, and it was their descendants who developed a new type of warfare that would prove so effective in their expansion: the mounted warrior or knight. Superior weapons, lances, kite shields, a system of feudal law, a new system of royal succession, military organisation, and building in stone saw the Normans quickly dominate England and expand across Europe to the Mediterranean and eventually the gates of Jerusalem in 1099 as part of the First Crusade. So the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, was only a matter of time. In 1169, Anglo-Norman mercenaries landed in Ireland to assist the deposed King of Leinster, Diarmaid MacMurrough, with the backing of the English King Henry II. Diarmaid MacMurrough had lost his kingdom in a feud, in a war, and he wanted, of course, to reclaim that back. Within weeks of landing, the Anglo-Normans, with allies of Diarmaid MacMurrough, had seized Leinster, and so the Anglo-Normans began to raid other neighbouring kingdoms. In 1170, a further Anglo-Norman landing took place, which brought Richard Strongbow de Clare, the Earl of Pembroke, who seized Dublin, Waterford and Wexford. Strongbow is a famous name in Ireland, and he was responsible for building some of the fine fortifications that still exist in the landscape in Ireland today. However, Strongbow's power was seen as a threat by King Henry II, and the potential for a rival Anglo-Norman Kingdom of Ireland, separate from England, was a distinct possibility. In May 1171, King Henry II landed to assert his control over the seized territory. Anglo-Norman expansion continued, and by 1177, Ireland becomes a Norman lordship. Their success is attributed to the lack of unity among the Irish, the support of the Catholic Church, and Anglo-Norman military superiority and castle building, which we've already discussed. We've talked a little about the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, and of course, to enforce their territorial achievements, the Anglo-Normans built fortifications. We know that early fortifications were of a motte and bailey type construction, so that's earth piled into effectively a mound with a wooden fortification on top, a bailey which would have housed accommodation for those garrisoning the stronghold. We know that Richard Strongbow de Clare built a number of motte and baileys, including Kilkenny on the site of where Kilkenny Castle is now. So that very early construction would have been a motte and bailey type. Many of these still exist in the landscape, particularly on the east coast of Ireland, and are marked on Ordnance Survey maps. We know, of course, though, that Strongbow, like every good Anglo-Norman lord, had a rival. And through that rivalry, stone castle building really commenced in Ireland, and there was a particular period for this building, which was from 1175 to circa 1310. Hugh de Lacy, with the blessing of the king, and in order to offset the power of Strongbow in Ireland, whom he did not trust, set about building a network of castles in his newly acquired domain, de Lacy being Lord of Meath. Having established his authority in the Kingdom of Meath with earth and timber castles, motte and baileys, he began to build more permanent and more spectacular stone structures. The earliest and most important of these is the impressive stone fortress of Trim. The large stone fortresses of the late 12th and early 13th centuries are the most spectacular evidence of domination of the Anglo-Normans in Ireland. Their location on high ground and in strategic positions close to river crossings and ports must have had a dramatic effect on the lives of the native Irish. Not only did they control the commerce of the country, but their massive piles dominated the landscape and intimidated the people. The success of the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland and the continued hostility towards them from the native Irish forced the building of further fortifications across the island. And of course, these fortifications developed over time. In recent years, a small type of castle or stronghouse, the Hall House, has come to the notice of archaeologists. These are two-storey rectangular shaped buildings with a first floor entrance and appear to have originated in the early 13th century. These buildings were in effect constructed in the same way as keeps or hall keeps in larger castle buildings. The main difference between a keep and the Hall House is that a keep is only one element of a larger castle complex, whereas the Hall House appears to be an isolated structure. The distribution of these buildings on present evidence is quite haphazard, with small clusters in North Tipperary, Galway, Mayo and Limerick. Because of their lack of defensive features, it is possible that they should not be classified as castles as such. However, since most of them date to the early 13th century, and are virtually indistinguishable from Hull keeps, the keeps of castles. They are included in the sort of pantheon of castles. They possibly had a wooden stockade, though there are a few earthworks remaining to indicate this, and more work is required. Large fortification did continue to be built into the 14th century, with a focus on strengthening curtain walls. 4 large fortresses, all built much in the same plan, were constructed late in the 13th century in the northern half of the country. Of these, Ballymote, County Sligo, Ballintober, County Roscommon, and Green Castle in County Donegal were all built by Anglo-Norman Lord Richard de Burgh when he was trying to gain control in that area of the northwest. The 4th, Roscommon Castle, was built by King Edward I. The change in castle building really came in 1429, when King Henry VI offered to every man in the English Pale around Dublin £10 grant to build a castle within 10 years, and the measurements were given as 20 feet by 16 feet and 40 feet in height. This grant provided the impetus to build the typical tower house that we see in the eastern half of Ireland. These tower houses, developed in the 15th century, would come to dominate the countryside across Ireland, and many such examples exist today. One such example, which unfortunately has disappeared, was the Castle McGrath at Abbeyside in Dungarvan, County Waterford. Towards the end of the 16th century and in the early 17th century, 2 new types of castles evolved, the fortified house and the strong house. This period also marked the end of the building of the tower house, which had lasted for over 200 years. Many of the tower houses built in the early 17th century reflect this change, as they became less defensive and provided more accommodation, while their outer defences became stronger. The fortified house was usually symmetrical, contained large windows and high gables. In fact, the windows could be quite decorative, and we can see that in the fortified house of Castle McGrath in County Donegal. The upper windows being in an Elizabethan style, indicating that this fortified house was built in the late 16th century during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. In Ulster in particular, the fortified house became ever more important in the plantation period. So in the late 16th and early 17th century, the Scots-English settlers and the Gaelic Irish occupied such fortified houses. The Castle McGrath, built on the shores of Lough Erne on the Donegal-Fermanagh border, was constructed in the late 16th century and is an excellent example of a fortified house. On the ground floor there are fashioned gun loops, so again marking the transition and importance of firearms and of gunpowder in this period. But as we move up the actual castle construction, we can see that the upper floored windows include fashioned window frames and crenulations across the top of the building for guttering, and the roof, being a very high pitched roof, would have captured obviously the rainwater and drained that away. On the corner of the building itself is a stairwell which is in a tower form, so again quite fashioned and also an attractive building. most importantly, the actual building itself is surrounded on three sides by a bawn wall, a bawn being an enclosed area within the castle compound, which can be used for stabling and as a reception area for people visiting the castle. The wall itself would have been very high, and the castle ruins still retains two sides of that particular bawn wall, with the front of the bawn wall having disappeared. This would have contained the actual entrance gate to it. So it's an excellent example of a fortified house built in the period of the late 16th century, and obviously used for luxurious accommodation for the ruling family in the particular area, this being of course the Clan McGrath, and also providing a form of fortification and safety in times of trouble. So the castle itself was commissioned by Archbishop Miler McGrath, who was at that time, and was for 50 years, Archbishop of the Diocese of Cashel in County Tipperary. Miler himself had been born in Termon McGrath and brought up there, entering the Franciscan order in Donegal at the start of his then ecclesiastical career. Of course, he quite famously converted from Catholicism to the Anglican tradition, and thereby was given initially the bishopric of Lough Erne and then the archbishopric of Cashel, moving there with some 200 supporters, including McGraths of Ulster, McMenamins and Monaghan's. We are fortunate to have the names in a pardon from King James in the early 1600s. That's a subject for another presentation. The castle itself then was commissioned by Miler, and it was his son James who took up occupancy in it, and again ensuring that the McGraths continued in this particular area. Of course, the McGrath Castle became a very potent symbol of the authority of the area, and in fact in 1610 James McGrath was awarded a grant of title to the lands of Termon McGrath under the English surrender and re-grant system. So the castle itself remained in the McGrath family's hands until in 1641, the outbreak of the Confederate Rebellion, which saw war come to Ireland in a civil conflict. The McGraths of Termon McGrath supported the rebels, and in turn the castle itself came under siege by a militia known as the Lough Erners. The castle was destroyed following that particular siege and lay empty for some considerable time afterwards. However, following the 1641 rebellion, the lands themselves transferred into the ownership of the Anglican Church and eventually into the hands of the Leslie family of Glaslough. There were plans initially to rebuild the castle, but these never came to fruition. And really, since the mid-1600s, the castle has fallen into disrepair, and what we have today is what you can see. So that brings us to the end of this, our first presentation in the online Clan McGrath Gathering 2020. Please look out for further presentations, and you can refer to our published itinerary for the online gathering. It's available on our website at www.clanmcgrath.org and on our Facebook and Twitter pages. We're always pleased to receive feedback. You can contact the Clan McGrath Society on info@clanmcgrath.org or leave a message through our Facebook page. I'd like to thank everyone who's helped with the compilation of this presentation, and also some recommended reading for you, which has been used in putting together this presentation. The Medieval Castles of Ireland by David Sweetman is a really good book. I highly recommend that for this presentation, and also for a history of the castle, Pedigo and its people, including a history of the Clan McGrath by John B. Cunningham, and Archbishop Meiler McGrath, The Enigma of Cashel by Patrick J. Ryan. So there's some books that I highly recommend that you read and get a hold of. Also, there will be a forthcoming book on the Clan McGrath history in Ulster and the association with the pilgrimage island of Lough Erne. It was due to be released as part of the Clan McGrath gathering in June 2020. But again, unfortunately, because of the COVID crisis and because of the cancellation of the gathering, the publication has been put back. But we look forward to publishing that in the near future when we can all again come together in person. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I'll leave you with our contact details. Thank you. Gur Maiagah.